History books tell us about slavery in the American South, about Caribbean plantations, about the horrors of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. But there are stories history forgot, stories deliberately erased, stories too shocking for their time to record openly, stories that survived only in fragments and whispers. This is one of those forgotten stories. Kofi was taken from West Africa, transported across the Atlantic and brought to Ireland, not to work plantations, but to serve in the household of a Protestant landowner named William Radcliffe in County Cork. And then, after William's death, something happened that was so extraordinary, so impossible by the standards of Georgian society, that the Anglo-Irish establishment worked desperately to erase it from history. Kofi married Eleanor Radcliffe, William's widow, a woman with auburn hair and skin pale as Irish snow. And through that marriage, he transformed from enslaved property to the husband of an Irish gentlewoman, managing the estate where he had once been owned. History forgot this story, but it survived. And this is what happened. There are stories that survive in official records, births registered, deaths recorded, marriages documented in church registers, preserved for centuries. And then there are stories that survive despite efforts to erase them. Stories where church registers show signs of amendment, where names have been obscured with different colored inks, where the historical record suddenly falls silent as if the people involved ceased to exist. Kofi's story is one of those stories that history tried to forget. In diocesan archives in Ireland, there exists a marriage register from April 1806 in a small rural church called St. Brigid's. The entry records a marriage between Eleanor Radcliffe, widow, and a man listed as K. Freeman, Freeman of Cork. The entry shows clear signs of later amendment. The ink colours differ. Letters appear to have been written over previous letters. The groom's full name is never given, only the initial K and the surname Freeman, a name that appears nowhere else in documents related to the Radcliffe household. Someone, at some point, tried to obscure what this register recorded, to make it less clear, less specific, less obviously shocking, because what this register recorded was a marriage that violated every boundary of Georgian-Irish society, a marriage between an Anglo-Irish widow of the Protestant gentry and an enslaved African man who had served her late husband's household. This was the story that history forgot, or rather, the story that history tried to make the world forget. But fragments survived, in oral histories collected generations later, in tenant family memories. In the amended register itself, which proves that something extraordinary occurred, even as it obscures the details. In the silence of the historical record after 1816, when Kofi simply disappears as completely as if he had never existed. To understand why history forgot this story, why it had to be forgotten, why the Anglo-Irish establishment worked to erase it, you must understand where the story began. It began in West Africa, in a world with its own names, its own languages, its own systems of family and community that had existed for countless generations. Kofi was born free. His name itself was Akan, given to boys born on Friday, connecting him to cultural traditions and a calendar system that structured time and meaning in his community. He had family, identity, a future that might have unfolded in ways we can never know. But that world was violently severed from him. He was captured, whether through warfare, through raids, through the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade that had corrupted and devastated West African societies. The historical record does not tell us. What we know is that Kofi was reduced from person to cargo, loaded onto ships designed to transport human beings as commodities, subjected to the Middle Passage across the Atlantic in conditions that killed vast numbers of those forced to endure them. This part of the story, The capture in Africa, the horror of the ocean crossing, is what most histories of slavery focus on when they remember slavery at all. This is the story that has been told. However incompletely, however sanitized for general audiences. But what happened after Kofi arrived in Ireland? That part of the story history forgot. By 1799, Kofi had reached County Cork in Ireland. He had been brought from Liverpool by British merchants with interests in both Atlantic commerce and Irish property. He entered the household of William Radcliffe, a Protestant landowner whose estate lay in the Irish countryside, where green hills rolled toward the Atlantic and ancient stone walls divided tenant farms. Kofi's role was defined from arrival: enslaved domestic servant, property owned by William Radcliffe. His legal status was property, not person. His future was whatever his owner determined. For 3 years, from 1799 to 1802, this was Kofi's existence: tending fires in the stone manor house, maintaining the household library, assisting with correspondence, serving the Radcliffe family's needs. Existing as property exists, to be used, with no acknowledgement of thoughts, desires, or humanity. This period left almost no historical record. No letters mention Kofi specifically. No estate documents describe him beyond listing one African servant among household property. He existed in the spaces of that household, but was invisible in history. And then, in October 1802, William Radcliffe died. And the story that history would try to forget truly began. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary household, something was developing that would challenge every assumption the Anglo-Irish gentry held about power, race, and the natural order of their world. To understand why history forgot Kofi's story, you must understand what the story meant for Georgian Irish society. Ireland, in the early 1800s, was a conquered nation under British rule, controlled by the Anglo-Irish Protestant minority, while the Catholic Irish majority lived in systematic oppression. This was a society built on rigid hierarchies: Protestant over Catholic, English over Irish, white over black, men over women, free over enslaved. These hierarchies were not merely social preferences, but foundational structures. They justified British rule over Ireland, Protestant control over Catholic lands, the enslavement of Africans, the subjugation of women. Every law, every custom, every social practice reinforced the idea that these hierarchies were natural, divinely ordained, unchangeable. If any part of the structure was questioned, the entire edifice was threatened. Kofi's story threatened the entire edifice, because after William Radcliffe's death in October 1802, something extraordinary occurred. William's widow Eleanor, a woman with auburn hair and skin pale as Irish snow, whose appearance marked her as a daughter of Celtic Ireland and the Anglo-Irish ruling class, made choices that violated every expectation of her society. She did not sell Kofi, as estates typically sold enslaved property to settle affairs. She did not accept male supervision, as widows were expected to do. She did not remarry appropriately within her class to restore proper male authority. Instead, she kept Kofi in the household. She elevated him to manage the estate alongside her. She formed a partnership with him that became increasingly visible and impossible for the community to ignore. And ultimately, in April 1806, she married him, an Anglo-Irish widow marrying her late husband's enslaved African property. The marriage violated every boundary that structured Georgian Irish society. If an enslaved African could marry an Anglo-Irish gentlewoman, what did that say about racial hierarchies? If property could become husband, what did that say about the nature of slavery? If a widow could choose her own partner against all pressure from male relatives and social custom, what did that say about patriarchal authority? The answers terrified the Anglo-Irish establishment because Kofi's story proved that hierarchies were not natural or unchangeable, that boundaries could be crossed, that the social order they insisted was ordained by nature, and God was actually maintained through laws, customs, and violence, and when those mechanisms failed or were circumvented, the natural order collapsed. This is why history had to forget the story. The Anglo-Irish establishment responded with ostracism. Eleanor and Kofi were completely excluded from high society. No family would receive them. No invitations arrived. At church, other families maintained careful distance, but ostracism was not enough to make the story go away. The marriage had occurred. The church register recorded it. Kofi managed the Radcliffe estate visibly, collecting rents from tenants, conducting business in Cork City, wielding authority that enslaved Africans were supposed to be incapable of exercising. So the establishment took additional steps to make history forget. Church registers were amended, the entry obscured with different colored inks, the groom's name reduced to an initial and a surname that appeared nowhere else. This made the record less clear to anyone examining it in the future, less obviously shocking, easier to dismiss or misinterpret. Silence was maintained. Families who knew what had happened did not speak of it openly. The scandal was acknowledged only in whispers, in private conversations, never in written records that might survive for historians to discover. And when Eleanor died in 1816 and Kofi disappeared from all records, no one investigated what became of him. No death certificate was filed, no burial record was made, no estate document acknowledged his existence or asked what happened to the man who had managed the Radcliffe property for 14 years. The historical record simply falls silent, as if Kofi ceased to exist, as if the entire story had never happened. This is how history forgets, not through dramatic book burnings or official decrees, but through small acts of erasure, amended registers, maintained silences, failures to record what everyone knows but no one once remembered. By these mechanisms, Kofi's story, taken from Africa to Ireland, from enslaved property to husband of an Irish gentlewoman, from invisible to undeniable, and back to invisible again, was forgotten by official history. But it survived in fragments, because complete erasure is impossible. The amended register still exists. Tenant families' oral histories preserved pieces of the story, and the very effort to forget, the amendments, the silences, the sudden disappearances from records, these themselves prove something extraordinary happened. This is the story history forgot, but we remember, and then in the autumn of 1802, everything changed. The years between William Radcliffe's death in 1802 and the marriage in 1806 are particularly forgotten by history. Almost no records detail what occurred during this period, but the absence of records is itself revealing. What we can piece together from fragmentary evidence is that Eleanor and Kofi formed a partnership that became increasingly visible and impossible for the community to ignore. Estate records from 1803 and 1804 show that the Radcliffe property continued to function smoothly. Rents were collected, tenant agreements were maintained, necessary repairs were completed. The estate was being managed competently, but not by male Radcliffe relatives, not by an appointed male steward, not through any of the mechanisms society expected. Eleanor was managing it herself, and Kofi was functioning as her partner and estate manager. Tenants began reporting, in accounts recorded only much later in oral histories, that they dealt with Kofi on estate business, that he collected rents in Eleanor's name, that he travelled to Cork City conducting commerce, that he was present during meetings with the estate's solicitor. Irish Catholic tenants had complex reactions. Some recognized fairness in how Kofi treated them, more consideration than many Anglo-Irish agents showed, less arbitrary cruelty than was common on estates of the period. Others resented the situation, conquered by England, their ancestors' land stolen, now dealing with an African who had somehow risen above them in the hierarchy of their oppression. The Anglo-Irish community found the partnership intolerable. Letters arrived at the Radcliffe Manor expressing concern about Eleanor's judgment during her time of grief. Social invitations that Eleanor had previously received ceased. At church on Sundays, conversations paused when Eleanor entered, resumed in lower tones after she passed. Several prominent families visited the local magistrate, a man named Harrison, suggesting that perhaps official inquiry might be appropriate. That in her widowhood, Eleanor's judgment might be compromised. That intervention might be necessary for her welfare and her daughter's protection. Harrison rode out to the Radcliffe estate. What transpired in his meeting with Eleanor is not recorded in detail, but afterward Harrison filed no report suggesting impropriety, made no recommendation for intervention, took no action to remove Kofi or force Eleanor to accept male supervision. Eleanor, somehow, had protection that the community didn't expect. Perhaps she knew secrets about prominent families that they preferred to keep hidden. Perhaps the estate's smooth functioning made intervention legally difficult to justify. Perhaps Harrison himself was less committed to strict enforcement of social boundaries than his position might suggest. For whatever reason, the partnership continued. For nearly 4 years, Eleanor and Kofi managed the estate together. The partnership was real, visible, and increasingly impossible to dismiss as temporary arrangement during a widow's grief. And then Eleanor formalized the partnership in the only way Georgian society recognized as legitimate, through marriage. This period, the 4 years of partnership before marriage, is particularly forgotten by history. Almost no contemporary documents describe it. It survived primarily in oral histories, in tenant family memories passed down through generations. In the collective memory of people who witnessed something extraordinary and told their children about it, even though official society pretended it hadn't happened. History forgot this partnership. But it was real, and it led to the marriage that history tried even harder to forget. What Eleanor did next would shock the county, though they wouldn't fully understand it for years to come. In April 1806, Eleanor and Kofi travelled to St. Brigid's, a small rural church 20 miles from the Radcliffe estate, far enough from County Cork's centre that the ceremony might occur without immediate interference from those who would have objected. The church's vicar was Reverend Thomas Kearney, an elderly man who had served his parish for more than 3 decades. He had witnessed joy and sorrow in countless families, had seen the complexities of human life that strict church law sometimes struggled to accommodate. On April 17, 1806, Reverend Kearney performed a marriage ceremony uniting Eleanor Radcliffe, widow, with a man listed in the register as K. Freeman, Freeman of Cork. This is the marriage that history tried to forget. The entry in the church register proves it occurred, but the entry itself shows signs of the forgetting process, different coloured inks, letters written over previous letters, details obscured or omitted. The groom's full name is never given, just the initial K and the surname Freeman, a name that suggests freedom rather than enslavement, a name that had never appeared in documents before this ceremony. A name that would never appear in documents again. Was Kofi formally manumitted before the marriage? Was Freeman a name he chose, or one that Eleanor and Reverend Kearney created to make the marriage technically permissible? The historical record does not tell us. The very absence of clarifying documents suggests that the marriage existed in legal grey space, possibly valid, possibly not, but occurring regardless. What was the ceremony like? Were Eleanor's daughters Mary and Anne present to witness their mother's extraordinary choice? What did Eleanor wear? Traditional white, or something more subdued appropriate to a widow's remarriage? What vows did they speak in that small stone church while Irish rain fell outside? And Kofi, standing before an altar in a Christian church, speaking English vows, binding himself through Christian ritual to the woman who had been his owner. What did he think of this moment? Did he feel liberation or new forms of constraint, relief or fear about the social storm this marriage would unleash? Love for Eleanor or calculation about the transformation this ceremony represented? The questions multiply across the centuries, but the answers were not recorded, perhaps deliberately not recorded, as part of the process of forgetting. What was recorded, however obscurely, is that the marriage occurred. And with that marriage, Kofi's transformation was complete. From captured African to enslaved property to estate manager to husband of an Irish gentlewoman. The journey that had begun in West Africa with violent capture reached this destination in a small Irish church where rain pattered on grey stone walls. History tried to forget this marriage, but the register survives, amended, obscured, but surviving, proving that on April 17, 1806, something impossible happened. In April 1806, in a small rural church far from prying eyes, something impossible occurred. After April 1806, Eleanor and Kofi lived together for 14 years in a marriage that history forgot, but which was undeniably real. Kofi lived in the Radcliffe Manor House, the 3-story building of grey stone where he had once been property. He managed the 300-acre estate, collected rents from tenant families, made decisions about repairs and leases, conducted business in Cork City. Every Sunday, he attended church sitting beside Eleanor in the Radcliffe family pew, that physical marker of belonging to the Anglo-Irish Protestant gentry, that symbol of social standing and inherited position. For 14 years, this continued, and for 14 years, history largely forgot to record it. Estate records from this period survive only in fragments. No letters describe the household's daily life. No diaries record Eleanor or Kofi's thoughts. The historical record treats these 14 years almost as if they did not occur, as if the marriage in 1806 was immediately followed by Eleanor's death in 1816, with nothing of note happening between. But the silence itself is revealing. The absence of records reflects the deliberate choice not to record, not to document, not to create evidence that future historians might discover. What we can piece together suggests that Eleanor and Kofi lived their marriage with quiet dignity despite complete social ostracism. The Anglo-Irish community never accepted the marriage as legitimate. No family would receive Eleanor and Kofi socially. No invitations arrived for the gatherings, dinners and balls that structured high society's life. At church, other families maintained careful distance, present in the same building but refusing to acknowledge Eleanor and Kofi's presence in ways that mattered. Eleanor's daughters bore heavy costs for their mother's choice. Mary and Anne's marriage prospects within their own class were destroyed. They eventually married far beneath their station, Mary to a Cork merchant in 1813, Anne to a ship's captain in 1815. The marriages had to be arranged with families outside County Cork, away from the immediate scandal. For Kofi, these 14 years represented extraordinary transformation and ongoing vulnerability. He wielded authority that enslaved Africans were supposed to be incapable of exercising. He managed property that property was not supposed to manage. He demonstrated intelligence and judgment that racial ideology insisted could not exist. But he remained vulnerable. There is no evidence he was ever formally manumitted. His position depended entirely on Eleanor's continued existence and choices. Without her, everything would collapse. The Irish Catholic tenant population witnessed these 14 forgotten years with complex emotions. Some dealt with an estate manager who treated them more fairly than many Anglo-Irish agents. Others resented every aspect of the situation: the African managing Irish land, the Protestant widow defying convention, the entire arrangement that seemed to mock their own exclusion and powerlessness. Through it all, Eleanor and Kofi lived together, managing the estate, attending church, occupying the manor house, living a marriage that society insisted could not legitimately exist, but which continued regardless for 14 years. These are the 14 years that history most thoroughly forgot. They left almost no contemporary documentation. They survived primarily in oral histories, in tenant family memories, in the collective knowledge of people who witnessed something extraordinary. But they were real. For 14 years, from 1806 to 1816, the impossible marriage endured. And then Eleanor died, and history's forgetting became complete. Kofi had, in effect, taken his master's place. But in Georgian Ireland, such defiance always carried a price. October 1816. Eleanor Radcliffe died at approximately age 50, buried on October 19th beside William Radcliffe in the Protestant churchyard. The parish register records her burial, but no will mentions Kofi. No estate document acknowledges his existence. No legal record addresses what should happen to the property he had managed for 14 years. And Kofi himself, the man taken from Africa to Ireland, who had transformed from enslaved property to husband of an Irish gentlewoman, simply disappears from history entirely. There is no death certificate, no burial record in Protestant or Catholic churchyard, no document addressing his fate, no inquiry into what became of him. The historical record, which had been sparse and fragmentary during the 14 years of marriage, now falls completely silent, as if Kofi ceased to exist the moment Eleanor died, as if he had never existed at all. This disappearance is not accidental. This is history ensuring its forgetting would be complete. With Eleanor's death, Kofi had no protection. The woman whose choices had transformed his life was gone. The foundation on which his entire position rested had crumbled. And the society that had never accepted his marriage or his authority now had opportunity to erase him completely. Perhaps he was forced to leave. Perhaps the community that had barely tolerated his presence while Eleanor lived now made that presence impossible. Perhaps he was driven from the manor house, expelled from the estate, pushed back into the invisibility from which Eleanor's choices had briefly elevated him. Perhaps he left voluntarily, recognizing that without Eleanor, his position was untenable. Perhaps he traveled to Liverpool or London, where he might find work and some measure of security in cities where his literacy and demonstrated capability might sustain him. Perhaps he died, through illness, through violence, through any of the countless ways lives ended in early 19th century Ireland. And his death went unrecorded because recording it would have required acknowledging he had existed, that the impossible marriage had occurred, that the story history wanted to forget was real. We don't know what happened to Kofi after Eleanor's death, and that absence of knowledge is itself evidence of how thoroughly history forgot him. If Kofi had been a respected member of society, his death would have been recorded. A burial would have been documented. His property, if he had possessed any legally, would have been disposed of through proper channels. But none of this occurred. Kofi simply vanished. The man taken from Africa to Ireland, who had lived an impossible transformation for 14 years, disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. This is how history forgets completely. Not just by obscuring records of what happened, but by ensuring that the ending leaves no trace. By creating a disappearance so thorough that later generations cannot even ask what became of the person. Because the evidence of their existence has been so carefully erased, Kofi's story, taken from Africa to Ireland, transformed through Eleanor's choices, lived for 14 years in marriage that violated every boundary, ends in disappearance. In silence, in forgetting so complete that we cannot even know how or when or where he died. This is the story history forgot or tried to forget, but fragments survive that prove it happened. More than 2 centuries later, we face a choice about Kofi's story. The story history forgot, the story deliberately erased through amended registers and maintained silences and thorough disappearances. We can accept the forgetting. We can focus only on the histories that were properly documented, that left clear records, that society chose to remember. We can tell ourselves that stories without complete documentation are unreliable, that we cannot know what really happened, that it's better to remain silent about what the historical record obscures. Or we can remember. We can piece together the fragments. We can recognize that the very effort to forget, the amendments, the silences, the disappearances, these themselves prove something extraordinary occurred that threatened the social order so profoundly that it had to be erased. We must remember what history forgot, because Kofi's story reveals truths that those who forgot it wanted hidden. It reveals that slavery in Ireland existed, that enslaved Africans served in Irish households, even though Ireland had no plantation economy, that the British Empire's system of slavery reached even this conquered island, where Catholics already lived under oppression. It reveals that racial hierarchies were not natural or unchangeable, that an enslaved African could demonstrate intelligence, judgment and capability for estate management equal to any Anglo-Irish gentleman, that the supposed natural inferiority of Africans was a lie maintained through law and violence rather than actual difference. It reveals that boundaries could be crossed, that an Anglo-Irish widow could choose an African partner despite all social pressure, that marriage could occur across racial lines even when society insisted such unions were impossible and abominable. It reveals that individual choices matter, that Eleanor's decisions transformed Kofi's life, that their partnership was real despite existing within systems of oppression, that human agency persists even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. And it reveals that the social order Georgian Ireland insisted was natural and eternal was actually fragile, that hierarchies maintained through law and custom could be challenged, that when individuals made choices that violated expectations, the entire structure trembled. This is why history had to forget the story, because remembering it would undermine the ideologies that justified slavery, racial hierarchy, patriarchal control, and British rule over Ireland. But we remember, because the fragments survive. Because amended church registers prove something happened that required obscuring, because oral histories preserved pieces of the truth across generations, because the disappearance itself, so thorough, so complete, proves there was something to disappear. We remember the story history forgot because it reveals that human beings can resist even total systems of oppression, that transformation is possible even when society insists it cannot be, that individual choices and partnerships can challenge structures that seem eternal. Kofi was taken from Africa to Ireland. He lived transformation from enslaved property to husband of an Irish gentlewoman. He managed an estate for 14 years. He occupied positions society insisted were impossible for someone with his history. And then he disappeared, as history ensured we would not easily remember him. But we do remember, because we must, because forgotten stories remain important, because the effort to erase them proves their power. This is the story history forgot. We tell it now, so it will not be forgotten again. How do we know Kofi's story, if history forgot it so thoroughly? Because complete erasure is impossible. Fragments always survive. And those fragments, when pieced together carefully, reveal the truth that those who forgot wanted hidden. The church register at St. Brigid's survived, amended, yes, with different coloured inks and obscured details. But the amendment itself proves something occurred that required obscuring. Why amend a routine marriage entry unless the marriage was extraordinary enough to threaten social order? The entry exists. Eleanor Radcliffe, widow, married K. Freeman on April 17, 1806. Whatever later authorities tried to hide, they could not erase the entry completely without destroying the entire register. So it survives as evidence, however obscured. Oral histories survived, tenant families remembered. They told their children about the African who managed the Radcliffe estate, who married the widow, who occupied positions that should have been impossible. These stories were passed down through generations, preserved in community memory even when official records fell silent. Researchers collecting Irish oral histories in the 19th and early 20th centuries encountered these accounts. They recorded them, often skeptically, often dismissively, but they recorded them, and those recordings survive today as evidence that something extraordinary occurred. The silence itself survived as evidence. The gaps in the historical record, the absence of documents describing Kofi's fate after Eleanor's death, the lack of estate records from the 14 years of marriage, the failure to record what should have been recorded, these absences are revealing. History does not accidentally forget in such systematic ways. The silence was deliberate, created by choices not to record, not to document, not to preserve evidence for future generations. Parish records from County Cork survived, showing that Eleanor was buried in October 1816, but no corresponding record for Kofi exists. This absence, in a society that carefully documented deaths and burials, proves that his death was deliberately not recorded, that his disappearance was ensured rather than accidental. The estate itself survived. The Radcliffe property continued to exist after Eleanor's death, eventually passing to others through legal mechanisms that make no mention of Kofi. This transfer, without acknowledgement of the man who had managed the estate for years, proves the systematic nature of the forgetting. And the fact that later authorities amended the church register proves they knew the story. Knew it was documented, knew it represented a threat that required obscuring even decades after the events occurred. These fragments, the amended register, the oral histories, the systematic silences, the gaps where records should exist, when pieced together, prove Kofi's story was real. Taken from Africa to Ireland, enslaved in the Radcliffe household, elevated after William's death, married to Eleanor, managing the estate for 14 years, then disappeared when Eleanor died. The story history forgot survives in fragments, and those fragments are sufficient to reconstruct what happened, to remember what we were meant to forget, to honor a life that society tried to erase. This is why we tell the story now, because the fragments survived, because we can piece them together, because remembering what history forgot is an act of justice toward those whose lives were deemed unworthy of memory. Kofi's story survived forgetting, and we ensure it will not be forgotten again. Kofi's story is not unique in being forgotten. Across the British Empire and beyond, there are countless stories of enslaved people whose lives took unexpected turns, who formed relationships that violated boundaries, who demonstrated humanity and capability that slavery's ideology insisted could not exist. Most of these stories were forgotten even more thoroughly than Kofi's. No amended church registers survive. No oral histories were recorded. No fragments remained for later generations to piece together. How many enslaved Africans lived in Ireland? The historical record is sparse because Irish slavery was domestic rather than plantation-based. Because numbers were small enough to be statistically invisible. because no one chose to document comprehensively what everyone preferred to forget. How many interracial relationships occurred, whether formal marriages or informal partnerships? Again, the record is sparse because such relationships violated boundaries so profoundly that they were suppressed, hidden, erased from documentation. How many enslaved people demonstrated intelligence and capability that challenged racial ideology? Countless numbers, surely, but their demonstrations were dismissed, their capabilities were attributed to white oversight, their intelligence was denied even when it was undeniable in practice. History forgot these stories systematically, not through accident or innocent oversight, but through deliberate choices not to record, not to preserve, not to remember what challenged the ideologies that justified oppression. Kofi's story survived better than most because the marriage created a document, a church register, that could not be completely destroyed without destroying entire record books, because Eleanor was prominent enough that complete silence was impossible. Because the transformation was so dramatic that people remembered and told their children despite official forgetting. But for every Kofi whose story survived in fragments, there are dozens or hundreds whose stories were forgotten completely. Enslaved people who demonstrated intelligence, who formed relationships across boundaries, who resisted in ways large and small, who lived lives that challenged the narratives slavery required. Their stories matter too, and the systematic forgetting of their stories matters, because the forgetting was not passive, but active, a process of erasure designed to maintain ideologies that justified oppression. When we remember Kofi's story, we honor not just him, but all those whose stories were forgotten even more thoroughly. We acknowledge that the historical record is incomplete, not through accident, but through design. We recognize that absence of documentation does not mean absence of humanity, of resistance, of lives that mattered. This is why recovering forgotten stories is crucial, because they prove that the histories we were taught, the histories that ignored or minimized slavery's reach, that insisted on racial hierarchies, that portrayed oppression as natural, were incomplete and deliberately distorted. Kofi was taken from Africa to Ireland. His story was forgotten, but it survived in fragments. And in remembering it, we commit to recovering other forgotten stories, to piecing together fragments, to honoring lives that history tried to erase. This is the work of memory, and it matters. More than 2 centuries after Kofi was taken from Africa to Ireland, we tell his story. The story history forgot, the story deliberately erased, the story that survived, despite systematic efforts to ensure it would not. We tell it not because it ended in triumph or permanent transformation. It didn't. When Eleanor died, Kofi disappeared, and we do not know what became of him. We tell it not because it changed Georgian Irish society or dismantled systems of oppression. It didn't. Slavery continued, racial hierarchies persisted, the Anglo-Irish establishment maintained its power. We tell it because the story proves that even total systems of oppression cannot completely suppress human agency. Human connection, human transformation. Kofi was taken from Africa, captured, enslaved, reduced to cargo, transported across the Atlantic, brought to Ireland to serve as property in a household of the Anglo-Irish gentry. His life was supposed to follow a predetermined path: servitude, powerlessness, invisibility, death without acknowledgement or memory. But his life did not follow that path. Through Eleanor's choices and his own demonstrated capability, through partnership that developed despite legal and social boundaries, through marriage that formalized their relationship despite society's horror, Kofi's life transformed in ways that should have been impossible. For 14 years, he managed an estate. He wielded authority. He demonstrated intelligence and judgment that racial ideology insisted Africans could not possess. He lived as Eleanor's husband in marriage that violated every boundary Georgian society recognized. History forgot this story because it had to, because the story proved that hierarchies were not natural, that boundaries could be crossed, that the social order was fragile rather than eternal. But we remember, because fragments survived, because amended church registers prove something happened that required obscuring, because oral histories preserve truth across generations, because systematic silences reveal what they sought to hide. Kofi was taken from Africa to Ireland. History forgot his story, but it survived in fragments, and we piece those fragments together now. We tell the story history forgot. We honor a life that society tried to erase from memory, because remembering what history forgot is an act of resistance against the ideologies that required forgetting. It proves that erasure is never complete, that humanity persists even when systems work to deny it, that stories survive even when powerful forces try to suppress them. In a grey stone manor in County Cork, in the constant Irish rain, for 14 years, an impossible transformation was lived, from enslaved property to estate manager, from invisible to undeniable. From someone whose humanity was denied to someone whose partnership with an Irish gentlewoman proved humanity transcended all boundaries. And then Eleanor died and Kofi disappeared, and history ensured we would forget. But we do not forget. We remember. We tell the story. We honor the life. We acknowledge the transformation, even though it ended in disappearance. Taken from Africa to Ireland, the slave story history forgot, but we remember, and in remembering, we ensure Kofi's story will not be forgotten again. We prove that even systematic erasure cannot completely suppress truth. We honor all those whose stories were forgotten even more thoroughly. This is the story history forgot. We tell it now, and we will continue telling it, because memory is resistance, and remembering what we were meant to forget is how we honor those who lived lives that systems tried to erase. Kofi's story survived, we remember, and we ensure it will not be forgotten again.